And then you can say, cut, Johnny baby, what are you doing to me? Come on, focus.
Ready.
Okay, ready? Hello, my name is John McIntyre, and I'm an adjunct teacher here at Triton College, as many of you are. I teach social science, specifically geography. I'm also a Toastmaster, which is a self-help group, mutually supportive, where people go to learn how to give better speeches, how to get over nervousness, how to do a good presentation, and a lot of what I've learned as a Toastmaster we can apply to teaching. This demonstration is really geared toward the first-time teacher who might be a little bit nervous, might not know exactly what to do, but if you've had experience as an instructor, I think a lot of what we'll be talking about can also be helpful for you. So without further ado, let's get started. Of course, here we have the auditorium where you may or may not be talking. You may have already done so. If not, you might be in this situation very, very soon. Do you hear that? What do you think that sound is? That sound is fear. Fear of the unknown and fear of public speaking. And for many people, just the thought of getting up before a group to give a lecture, to teach a class, to teach a lesson, or any other situation where you're giving a public presentation, certain symptoms come to mind. Some of those symptoms might include knocking knees, shaking hands, shortness of breath. You might feel like you're going to pass out. Your heart's racing. You'd rather be anywhere but where you are now, about to give your first lecture. This is not uncommon, and it's technically called glossophobia, again from the root word gloss or glossa in Greek, meaning tongue or words. And phobia, of course, is the classic term for fear. So glossophobia is the fear of public speaking. Very, very common. About 80% of American citizens have glossophobia, and it can be very petrifying and paralyzing. So if you have glossophobia, you're not alone. And again, the purpose of our talk is to help you get over some of these hurdles. When we do a presentation, including a lecture or give a class, sometimes we like to call them discussions. Lecture has sort of a negative connotation. Usually you get lectured to by your in-laws, so we'll just call them discussions. In the class, we really have two things going on at the same time, two different criteria that the students will be looking to you to do well. First is content, which is what's the information you're actually trying to get to the students, and then the delivery, which is how you're actually doing in terms of getting that information out so that the students can understand what you're saying. So we'll do content first. In other words, if you've never done this before, how do you set up a decent class session, a discussion, or a lecture, if you will? It's also a good idea to remember that a good idea that's presented very, very poorly will lose out to a bad idea that's presented well, which is, again, kind of a reminder as to why being able to express yourself very convincingly, very clearly, and again, with a lot of enthusiasm can be important so that the good ideas get through and not just simply the bad ideas. So first we need to find out what kind of a presentation are you trying to do. There's informative, inspirational, motivational, entertaining, comforting, rebuking, and persuasive. As a teacher here at Triton College, most of the time you're going to be giving an informational presentation. Sometimes it might be comforting, entertaining, perhaps rebuking. But for the most part, they'll be informational, and that's what we'll be focusing on. An inspirational speech is a speech or a talk or a discussion that allows the listener to feel good about himself or herself. You can do it, you're a good guy, you're a good gal, just keep pressing on and good things will come to you. A motivational speech, this is the difference between an inspirational and a motivational speech, is a motivational speech is a call to action. Get up and get doing something, set a plan, start working, get active, achieve those goals. It's again a kind of a call to action. Entertaining, of course, many cases humor, an after dinner speech, something like that. And you certainly want your lectures to be entertaining along with being informative. Comforting might be a eulogy, it might be after a disaster, to talk people into being comforted, to feel better about themselves, to look forward to a tough situation, or not forward to the tough situation, but to be able to look, once things calm down, to be able to pick themselves up and keep moving. Rebuking, that's another word for scolding. That can happen if the students aren't paying attention. You may have to break away from the informative presentation and go into rebuking. One example actually comes from a religious setting. There was a minister who was trying to raise additional funds to build a library right next to the church, and he kept begging and begging the congregation to come up with extra money to build this library, to no avail. One day he sat the congregation down and said, "Hey, I've got good news and I've got bad news. The good news is we finally have enough money to build that additional library. The bad news is it's still sitting out there in everybody's pockets." So that was sort of a very gentle way of rebuking or sort of chiding the congregation to dig down a little bit deeper to come up with the funds, and fortunately it was very effective. Persuasive, of course, is when you're trying to persuade somebody to do something or refrain from doing something. Political talks, marketing ploys, things like that, we use persuasive speaking. And as an instructor, you'll probably have to use all of these different modes of communicating, but again, we'll focus, at least for the present time, on informative. Now that you know it's an informative talk, you have to figure out, what am I going to say? What's the content of what I'm going to teach the students? And you know your subject better than certainly I do. And there's different ways of teaching. Sometimes it's hands-on, sometimes it's more listening, sometimes it's more visual. If you're teaching art, as in sculpting, that's going to be different than teaching engineering, but there's still some commonalities in whatever you're teaching that we'll review. Of course, as in any presentation, you should have an introduction, the body of the speech or the body of the topic you'll be talking to the students about, and then a conclusion. So when you start the class, if it's not already written in the syllabus, which it should be, you should start talking about, today we'll be talking about X, Y, Z. And here's why it's important. And then, of course, when you're done talking about the topic at hand, always give a conclusion, sort of summarize everything you just talked about. The basic equation for doing a presentation or a discussion in class is say what you're going to say it, and then say what you said. And that applies really to any kind of a speech. Have an introduction where you're going to talk about what you're going to talk about it, and then talk about what you just talked about. If you do that, you really can't go wrong. Some tips from the pros. The art of writing a lecture is the art of rewriting. There's different equations for how many hours of preparation it takes for 1 hour of actual class time. And it can vary from 3 to 7 hours, depending on exactly, again, what you're talking about and the level of difficulty at which you're teaching it. So when you're writing a lecture, including even the outline, write it and come back a few hours, a few days later, and rewrite it. You'll be surprised at some of the things you omitted or the things you've included that you don't really need. When you write a lecture or a term paper or a speech first, again, write the body first, then the conclusion, then the introduction. That's sort of a common way of keeping the theme of what you're saying coherent and that it flows easy. Again, if you write the introduction first, as you're writing the body, it might start varying from the direction that the introduction indicated it would go. So if you write the content of your lecture, then the conclusion, then the introduction, that'll save you a whole lot of time and it'll make your class discussion a lot easier to follow. For the body, it's often easy to use fact, then story, fact, story, fact, story, just like windshield wipers going back and forth. Give a fact or an interesting statement, and then back it up with an illustration. Again, that may vary depending on the topic that you're teaching and the difficulty of the topic, but generally that works. Give a statement, a fact, and then show how it's applied in the real world, and it makes it a lot easier to follow, again, just like windshield wipers. And don't present information above or below the student's level of understanding. So if you're giving a talk to a bunch of professors, don't start with, okay, before we start, who has to use the restroom? Come on. Or if you're talking to a bunch of children, don't start talking about advanced physics because they'll get lost. So talk to the level at which your students are. So you're not talking above them or below them. They could get bored if you're talking below them, and if you talk above their level of understanding, you might lose them very, very quickly. So in the introduction again, state what today's topic or lecture will be about. It should be concise, try not to ramble or be vague. And if you can, include a hook, a provocative statement, an interesting question, something to get and keep the class interested. It might be a statement like, do you know there's only 3 types of people in the world? Those who are good at math, those who are not. Just wanted to see if anybody was paying attention and thought that. But something like that, something to draw people in to what you're talking about so they think, you know, I really need to find out about what this topic is, how it can benefit me. Again, body should be the subject of the presentation. Sometimes it's easy to wander or go down blind alleys, but if we stay focused on script, as they say, so much the better. It should flow in a logical manner, basically from sort of the general topic to the specific applications. That way, there's no backtracking or skipping around, and it's much easier for the teacher to stay on track and much easier for the student to follow what the lecture or the discussion is all about. And if you can, as you're designing the lecture, sort of think about what kind of questions the students will have and try to answer them in the body of the discussion or the lecture. That way, the students will feel better. They don't have to risk being shy or asking a question that they may think might be so-called stupid. So again, if you can do that, so much the better. Again, anticipate questions that the students or whoever is in the audience will probably ask. Again, try to use the windshield wiper approach, fact, story, fact, story, fact, story. Again, it depends on really the application and what you're teaching. That's easier to do in some cases. Architecture, maybe not so much, but try to work that in there if you can. The conclusion, again, should just simply be a restatement of the introduction, a summary of the lecture's key points, and try to end with an interesting or humorous quote, a call to action, something like that. Because remember, usually the introduction to a talk, some of the key points in the body, but we always remember the conclusion, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. So by ending the lecture or the discussion with a very, very key point, again, that will help the students remember what the lecture was about and the content of that discussion. Again, and if you can, try to use a summary of some of the words, the vocabulary that's unique to the discussion that you just conducted. Okay, so again, remember, iterate the key points that will likely be on the exam. So state something 3 or 4 times if you want the students to really know this. And that way, if they're sharp, it'll anticipate, or they'll anticipate that being on an exam or a quiz or something that will come up later. Again, stress and define the vocabulary that's unique to the topic under discussion. Engage the students in the discussion. Try to encourage what-if questions if possible. Sort of flip the class, get them to think, well, based on my experiences, here's what I already know about the subject. Again, call on all students routinely. You don't want some of the wallflowers to feel neglected, although they prefer that occur. And you also don't want other students to dominate the discussion, so if at all possible, make sure all students are participating. And if possible, again, change directions, get small group discussions, hands-on activities, so on and so forth. And again, a lot of this is sort of fairly obvious, so again, try to work those into the class, and again, it'll help keep the students engaged and help them to learn and remember everything that you talked about. Okay, now for the delivery. This is probably the part of the discussion here that you're looking forward to. How do you get over that fear of public speaking or fear of getting in front of the class for the first time, the second time? What do you do with your hands? How do you work with the lecture? What about props? All these questions are probably making you more nervous than you already are. So we'll address some of those and help you get over those. I think we all know who William Henry Harrison is. He was the 9th president of the United States. And the reason I bring this up is, besides assassinations, he was the only person ever known to have died because of a speech. In March, they just found out that he had become president. Again, this was back in the old days, where they didn't have electronic anything, and it literally took about 5 to 6 months to count all the votes, deliver them by horse, and find out who was president. So in March, he became president, and he gave his inaugural speech. It was a cold March day, and his handlers said, look, it's a cold, rainy day, cut the speech short, don't go on and on, or you'll catch pneumonia and die. Well, during his inaugural address, he went on and on and on, and sure enough, he caught pneumonia and died. Literally 1 month to the day that he took office, he caught pneumonia and died. He was bedridden for most of his administration and didn't really do much except lay in bed and have pneumonia and then ultimately died. Personally, I think he was one of the best presidents we ever had because he wasn't in office long enough to cause any damage. So, way to go, William Henry Harrison. So other than that, public speaking in front of people, including students, is relatively safe. So again, when we talk about speaking in public and anxiety that it causes in most people, again, 80% by most counts, we can look at people's biggest fears. And as you might guess, people's number one fear, the thing they fear more than anybody else, you guessed it, public speaking. Number 2, believe it or not, is death by drowning. Number 3, the biggest fear is fear of snakes and spiders. So the biggest fear is public speaking. The second biggest fear is death by drowning. So, looks like we got some numbers coming by. What this means is that at a funeral, most people would rather be in a coffin than giving the eulogy. That is how powerful fear of public speaking, fear of making a presentation in front of people is. So again, it's not uncommon, and it can paralyze people literally out of advancing, out of fully participating in life. So how do we overcome speech anxiety, including the we've never taught before? This can be very, very overwhelming, and certainly it can strike anxiety and fear even to the most hardy of us. Well, first of all, acknowledge your fear. It's normal. You're not alone. You're not the only one by any means that has this fear. Believe it or not, a lot of people who are performers get fear. Donny Osmond, a very famous entertainer, often had fear of going out on stage. Very, very common. People who seem very poised on stage still get those terrible, terrible butterflies. Practice, practice, practice. The more you practice, the more it becomes secondhand. So before giving your lecture, rather than so-called winging it, go out and practice it first so that you're comfortable speaking and talking about the subjects. And the more you know a subject, the more comfortable it is, the more you feel that you won't lose your place and all those good things. And passion. If you're teaching a subject, we hope that you're already passionate about it, that you really enjoy talking about it. But if you're passionate about the subject, you're going to be more focused on the subject and what you're saying, and hopefully that passion will be contagious. The students will get this. That way you're going to be focusing on the message rather than thinking, oh man, I look like a fool. Boy, I didn't dress right, and everybody thinks I have no idea what I'm doing. So passion, very, very important. You can sort of think of yourself like a championship thoroughbred. If you look at some of the best race horses before they open the gate, the horses are prancing and digging and motion, they're nervous. And you can sort of think of yourself as a championship racehorse. You have something important to say, you have something important to teach, you have valuable information you need to get across, so of course you're going to be nervous and anxious to get going with the process. If you're one of those old horses that are retired, they're sort of laid back, they sort of mosey around, you don't want to be like one of those. You want to be like the championship racehorse. You've got something to say, and you've got places you need to go. So we've also heard another term for that nervousness is the butterflies in the stomach, which again, a lot of people's stomach starts turning when they think, oh, I've got to go up and talk in front of a bunch of people. Again, the butterflies are fine, but what we're going to look at is how to get these butterflies flying in formation. So you can take that nervous energy and actually use it to your advantage. So again, butterflies are okay as long as they're working for you and not against you. So by the way, when you're up talking in front of a group of people, nobody thinks you're an idiot, and if they do, they've got the problem, not you. What they're probably thinking, or if they're mentally healthy, what they should be thinking is, there but for the grace of God go I. And at least that teacher, that talker, that lecturer, that speaker, at least they had the guts to get up and actually do the presentation. So if you're worried about what people are thinking about you, they're probably just glad they're in the seats, they're not up in front of everybody talking. By the way, you don't look anywhere near as nervous as you might feel. A lot of times, the audience or the students can't even really tell. Some of the things you can do is use humor if you go blank. Most teachers like to use Blackboard or PowerPoint. A lot of times they'll use notes, but like me, if you're the type that don't really like to use notes, sometimes you can go blank. This also applies if you're talking in another venue, again, a Rotary Club or something like that. If you go blank, come up with a humorous little quote to get the audience laughing until you regain your train of thought and figure out what you're going to say. Two of my favorite is if you're talking and you go blank, you say something like, wow, my train of thought just left the station and I wasn't on it. Or, you know, the human mind is a very, very interesting organ. It starts working the moment you're born. It stops working the moment you have to get up and give a presentation. Usually the audience can relate. They'll laugh, chuckle for about 5 seconds. That'll give you at least some time to figure out, okay, where was I? What was I saying? So, and there's many out there. You can Google them. And there's actually books on public speaking. Use notes, but don't hold them. Because again, you're not as nervous as you look, but sometimes your hands might tend to shake a little bit. And one of our sort of ways we correct that is we tell somebody after a lecture, you know, you didn't look very nervous, but the paper you were holding sure did. So if you're nervous, try to put the paper down or put it behind the lectern or carry those little 3.5 or 3x5 cards. So again, you're not visibly shaking as you're holding your notes. Lecterns are very, very good. A lot of times we tend to hide behind the lectern. And when you're using a lectern, and I'll move very slowly so we don't lose focus, the best thing to do is just basically lay notes on the lectern and place your hands gently on the lectern unless you're making a gesture. I've seen some professors, I used to do this too, you hold on to that lectern while you're talking as if you're afraid it's going to grow legs and walk out of the door. Just reassure you it won't, so just don't worry about the lectern, just sort of lay your hands on it, don't try to force it to not leave the building. Use props to distract. Props are sort of an interesting thing. Those are anything that you can use to help illustrate a purpose. I remember listening to one talk about somebody who lost 15 pounds, and as a prop, she used a bowling ball. and hung it around her neck like a necklace to illustrate the amount of weight she lost and how much better she felt after losing that 15 pounds. The homiletics example, many times in your house of worship, whoever's officiating might get nervous talking to the congregation. Everybody's looking at the official, so whoever it is might take the scriptures and make a quote, and they say, just thus saith the scripture. So while they're holding the scriptures, they know everybody's eyes are at least on the scriptures for just a moment, and they're not looking directly at you. Now, other things about props, and particularly the types of props that we have here, if you can, don't display the props until you're actually ready to use them. If you do, you can get into all kinds of problems because people will be looking at the prop rather than listening to what you're saying. So here we have one prop. We have, of course, a little slogan, let's eat grandma. Of course, what we did is we forgot the comma. And it's going to be a lot more interesting and a lot more logical to say, let's eat grandma, rather than let's eat grandma. A very important distinction, particularly if you're grandma. We can sort of look at the importance of the comma as it is pausing during a presentation. You want to pause as you're doing a transition to a different thought to give your students a chance to absorb what you just said, or for a dramatic introduction to a new topic. So pause is very important. And by the way, let me go back here. When you have these kinds of charts, there are several things you can do. You can point to it and talk. Sometimes you can walk behind it. You can hug it. But what you shouldn't do, and I still do this after all these years of talking, is don't go up there and talk directly to it. Because again, the audience can't hear what you're saying. And in many cases, you're blocking the prop, and so that sort of defeats the purpose. Look for friendly faces in the audience or in the class. Try to sweep all four corners of the class in the center. Look for the students that are paying attention, taking notes, things like that, and that sort of helps encourage you and doesn't sort of deflate your abilities because you're looking at everybody and they're pretty much falling asleep. Also, take a deep breath on occasion. You might be breathing very, very rapidly in a very, very shallow manner, and you might start talking way too quickly. You should talk basically in a conversational type of manner and pitch. They say females speak at about 132 words per minute. Males speak at about 118 words per minute. I speak at about 100 words per minute with gusts up to 200. So again, just bear in mind that genders, and of course everybody's an individual, generally speak at a different speed. So also different ethnicities, things like that. As we get older, sometimes we slow down. So again, just speak at what's comfortable and what makes you confident. And when you practice, is you know the subject so thoroughly that at 3 in the morning they can wake you up out of a deep sleep, whoever they are, ask you any question about that topic, no matter how difficult, and you'll immediately be able to rattle off the correct answer. So it helps when you're practicing to really know your subject. That'll also give you a lot of confidence and get you over that fear of speaking in front of your class. You can practice the discussion of the lecture into a recorder in front of a video camera, if they still call them that. And then you can sort of see, are my gestures working? Is my humor working? Is there a better way I could basically state whatever the issue is or whatever the subject is? Practice in front of a mirror, practice in front of friends, families, pets. Practice while driving. If you know basically your topic, you can actually practice lecturing or doing the discussions in front of the class as you're driving along. And if you don't need notes, that again will do wonders to bolster your confidence. And if you're brand new, find a teacher that you can model yourself after. Your favorite teacher. How did they speak? What did they do? What were their mannerisms like? What was their volume? What were their gestures like? Did they use props? And model that teacher until you become comfortable enough where you can establish your own style. And from my own personal discussions with other teachers, it takes about 3 to 6 semesters for you to finally get your own style down, and you can, again, sort of leave your mental mentor and break out on your own. Again, passion, if you care about the subject. I've heard some discussions that were very, very technically correct. The grammar was perfect, no ums or ahs, but it was dull. And I've heard some people were really terrible with grammar and everything else, but they had passion about what they were talking about. And those people with passion held the day. So again, if you're passionate about it, you'll focus more again on the message rather than what the audience is thinking about you. Delivering tips. Again, effective eye contact, look around. You don't want to just focus on one side of the class or the other side, or just the back or just the front. If you're sweeping the classroom, everybody feels like they're involved with the discussion. Effective language, again, appropriate for the subject and audience. Beware of certain terms that have to do with regions. In Chicago, we have different words that we don't use anywhere else in the world. Words like cup of two tree and the end of the. As in, go to the end of the street, hang a louie, and go to the Jewels, get a cup of 2-3 pounds of Polish sausage. It'll cost you about $1.80. Come on, the Bears are about to play. Okay, so that's something that you hear here, but you may not hear literally in any other city in the world. Every other city also has their own strange things. So try to watch for those little sort of bits of grammar and words that are very unique to a certain location. Unless you're talking to fellow Chicagoans, then they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Effective gestures, not too big or sweeping, but also not too small. Use of hands. Well, there's a lot of things we can do with our hands. They say, generally speaking, if you're not doing gestures, hold them to your sides with palms out, facing up. That connotates being honest, open, that you've got nothing to hide. A lot of other people, especially when they're starting to talk, they start doing this, sort of the snidely whiplash thing with their hands. Well, class, today we're going to talk about, binomial numbers or something. That can be very distracting. The best thing to do is, if you're not using gestures or holding your hands open or you're not using notes, is just put them by your sides. That way you know where they are at all times. Some people put their hands in their pocket and they'll start jingling their keys. And we call that being the key executive. So again, that's very distracting. It can happen. Other teachers just like to go military parade rest. They keep their hands behind their back. But I need to remind you that this is the position your hands are right before the cop cuffs or the police cuffs you. So that's probably not a good thing. So again, either at your sides, holding notes, or open is the best thing to do unless you're doing a gesture. Be enthusiastic. I mean, nobody wants to hear a monotone, boring talk, no matter how interesting the subject is. Otherwise, they'll fall asleep. And if you're not interested in the subject, how do you expect your students to get enthusiastic and excited about your subject? And again, use a conversational style. Try not to do the lecture like you're just simply reading out of Shakespeare. Again, it's a talk. You're not reading unless you happen to be reading or quoting for somebody. Speak like we're just speaking, like you're almost speaking one-to-one to each student, rather than, again, reading some very complicated type of thing. Even though it's the same language, English, whatever the language is, the way we speak, the way we write, sometimes can be different, so we need to use the conversational style. Again, use notes as needed. Often, if you're very familiar with the subject, you can just write your notes in outline form, so if you get lost, you can refer to them. But again, if you simply write everything and just simply read directly from a lecture, it can get boring, and again, you've lost that conversational style. So again, props, again, they're appropriate to the presentation. Don't display until needed. Don't put too much on the charts, usually 5 to 7 items. Other than that, it can get confusing and that'll start actually hurting the process, hurting the presentation rather than helping. Again, don't talk to the props like I tend to do. Also, check the equipment ahead of time. Make sure there's a spare bulb for all the electronic equipment. Make sure all the electronic gizmos and things that you're going to be using are functioning and working rather than starting the discussion and then finding out they don't work. It can be very distracting and cause more anxiety and nervousness that you certainly don't need as a new instructor. Elements of vocal delivery. As soon as here we go. Speed rates and pauses. Don't speak too quickly, and don't, again, speak too slowly. Students think a lot faster than we speak, so sometimes their mind will tend to drift. So speak at a lively pace, but don't go too fast that they can't record the notes. And again, use pauses as a way to emphasize things. Other tricks you can use is raise your voice at a certain key point or start to whisper. That way people will lean in and think, wow, here's a secret I better get in on. So there's different ways to use pauses and vocal variety and inflection or volume to get the point across. But pauses are good. They're a transition from one thought to another. It gives the students a chance to think about what you just said, or if you pause, it can be a dramatic transition into something, or you can use it prior to making a very important point. Crutch words, this is something we all do especially when we're first new. Crutch words are like, this means like, and all new speakers will use those. A lot of times, if you tape yourself speaking, you can say, wow, I said 38 times, 43, and or like 28 times in 1 hour. And you can learn to watch these things. Again, if you'll notice, very accomplished speakers will usually never use a crutch word. It's just simply a way of filling in silence or giving yourself a pause as you go from one thought to another. Most people don't mind it, but some people, especially if they're Toastmasters, they can sort of distract from what you're saying. Volume, it should be loud enough so the person way in the back of the class can hear you fairly easily. You don't want to be too soft. On the other hand, you don't want to shout out and deafen the people in the front row, so you've got to find that medium. You can even ask the people in the back of the class, can you hear what I'm saying okay? And if they said, yeah, everything's great, then you can use that volume as you speak. Inflection and pitch, sometimes called vocal variety. Again, that means don't be monotone. It doesn't mean you have to be drama queen theatrics. If you're talking about a big bear or the little child running, just make sure that your vocal variety is going up and down, and you're not being monotone. The quality of your voice. A lot of professional speakers, quite literally, no matter how hot it is, will not use air conditioning in their home or at their place of work because that can strain the vocal cords. Sometimes a suppress or one of those lozenges before you give a lecture or a talk can help. Gargling with salt water can help. One of the things they always recommend is never eat dairy products before talking because it has the effect of sort of gumming up the voice. It makes your vocal cords less able to vibrate. It can change the quality of your voice and also cause you to sort of tire out and lose your voice much more quickly. So if you're about to have that cup of yogurt right before getting the talk, you may want to think of something else. And then pronunciation and articulation. Again, we all have different dialects, regional dialects, and so on and so forth. And pronunciation, we always lapse into, rather than saying doing or saying, say doing or saying. And again, most of us don't worry about it. Probably the last person that had a problem with it was your third grade grammar teacher. But again, if you pronounce the words properly, and you'll notice as I've been giving my talk, I haven't done that, so it's something I need to work on. and to be articulate, to say the entire word. Try not to use jargon without explaining what it first means, or slang, unless everybody's familiar with whatever the slang term is. So again, watch your pronunciation, your articulation, your P's and Q's, so to speak, when it comes to speaking. So if you do well, you certainly won't have this as you're speaking to your class. They won't be falling asleep. Hopefully they'll be engaged, interested in what you're saying. They'll think, wow, this is a very, very skilled teacher. I wish someday I'll be able to speak as well and communicate as well as my teacher. Again, if this is your first class, it takes practice. You're going to be nervous for a while. Again, it's not unusual. One other tip about getting over nervousness is just think of an experience you've had in your past, whether it was teaching or anything else where you just nailed it. Everything went well. It just went perfect, whether it was writing a paper or acting in a play or passing an exam, and sort of get yourself in that frame of mind before you go out and speak. That way you'll already be positive, energized, and thinking in a positive way. So again, you won't be worried about, oh, they're going to think I'm a fool, or they're going to think I'm this or that. So we'll avoid that. So again, if you plan, prepare, polish, practice, and present your talk or your lecture, generally in that order, plan what you're going to say, prepare it, polish it through practice, practice, and then you make the presentation. You should do well. Again, you're not going to appear to be anywhere near as nervous as you are, so you've already got that going in your favor. So again, the better you know the material, the less anxious you'll be. And again, you're already a specialist in your topic. It's just how do you get from knowing the topic to being able to comfortably present it and teach it. So smile, act natural, be yourself, and never apologize for being nervous. I can't tell you how many times people start a talk or a presentation with, oh my gosh, I'm just so nervous. I'm really sorry. I know I'm going to blow it, but I'm really nervous. Again, the audience can't tell until you tell them, or you might seem a little anxious, but you don't look anywhere near as nervous as you feel. So again, don't call attention to it and never apologize for it. So again, your job as the teacher is to talk, your student's job is to listen. Hopefully you and your students will both finish your jobs at the same time. One other bit of wisdom from a Toastmaster's point of view is that when you give a talk or a lecture or a discussion, you actually give three of them. There's the lecture that you rehearse, there's a lecture that you actually give, and then there's a lecture that you should have given that you're thinking about over and over again on your way home. So that concludes our presentation. Hopefully there's some nuggets of information and knowledge and wisdom that you can take with and work with, and so that you'll be over your nervousness in no time. You'll be running on all cylinders, and the more experience you get, the more confident you will get, and before you know it, you won't even remember those evil, awful days of being nervous when giving a presentation. Thank you for your kind attention, and we'll see you at the next CTE presentation. Okay.